Tonight, we'll journey to meet the fourth Pope, a man who bridged the Apostolic age with the early Church. I'll tell a single story and leave you with a short prayer to carry this piece into sleep. You'll discover how his surviving letter has long been treasured in the Church, and often cited as an early, influential witness to apostolic order and unity. We'll explore his beautiful words about love covering a multitude of sins, and how his call for humble obedience brought peace to a fractured community. Most importantly, you'll see how this ancient saint's wisdom offers the same gentle guidance for finding rest and unity in our own restless hearts today. But first, let's meet this remarkable man whose name appears in the most unexpected place. A later, long-standing tradition identifies Clement with the man Paul greets in his letter to the Philippians, where the apostle sends greetings from Clement and the rest of my co-workers. Just one line. A simple mention among other faithful servants. Yet this same Clement would rise to become the fourth pope, though few Christians today know his remarkable story. Picture ancient Rome in the 1st century, where narrow streets buzzed with merchants, slaves, and citizens from across the empire. In this bustling city, a man named Clement walked the same cobblestones as Peter and Paul themselves. He listened to their teachings in small gatherings. He watched them pray. He saw their faces light up when they spoke of Christ's resurrection. The early church fathers treasured this connection. Irenaeus, who lived close enough to the apostolic age to hear their echoes, testified that Clement saw the blessed apostles and conversed with them. Some early writers, such as Tertullian, say Clement was ordained by Peter. This is part of the Roman tradition linking Clement directly to the apostles. These weren't casual observations. These men understood they were preserving precious memories of living links to Jesus himself. Imagine the weight Clement carried as he aged. Each day took him further from the apostolic era and deeper into a new age of the Church. He remembered Peter's voice when he explained a difficult passage. He could recall Paul's gestures when he taught about love. But around him, the Church was growing rapidly. New communities sprouted in distant cities. Questions arose that the apostles had never directly addressed. The bridge between what was and what would be grew longer each passing year. Clement held memories that no written gospel could capture. He knew how Peter prayed before making hard decisions. He had seen Paul's patience with difficult converts. These personal experiences shaped his understanding of apostolic authority in ways that mere study could never achieve. When challenges arose, he didn't just consult teachings. He drew from lived experiences with the men who had walked with Christ. The Church Fathers recognized this unique position. They wrote about Clement not just as another bishop, but as someone who embodied continuity itself. Through him, the apostolic flame passed to the next generation. His ordination wasn't simply an administrative appointment. It was a sacred transfer of authority that traced directly back to the upper room. In Rome's growing Christian community, Clement served quietly for years. He baptized new believers in the Tiber's waters. He celebrated the Eucharist in private homes. He guided confused converts through their first steps in faith. His days were filled with the ordinary work of pastoral care, but his nights were spent in prayer, carrying the weight of responsibility that came with apostolic succession. The other bishops throughout the empire knew about Clement's special status. When they wrote letters or made decisions, they often sought his counsel. Not because Rome was the largest Christian community, though it was growing rapidly. Not because of political power, though the city ruled the world. They turned to Clement because he carried apostolic memories that were slowly disappearing as the first generation of believers aged and died. This personal connection to the apostles gave Clement something precious that mere scholarship could not provide. He possessed what we might call apostolic instinct. When faced with new situations, He could ask himself not just what the apostles had taught, but how they would have responded. This inner compass would prove essential when crisis struck the church. The only uncontested writing we have from him is the first epistle to the Corinthians, written late in the 1st century to settle a dispute. This letter reveals the heart of a man who understood both apostolic authority and pastoral love. As Clement grew older, he watched the church change around him. The informal gatherings in homes gave way to more structured worship. The simple sharing of bread and wine developed into elaborate liturgical celebrations. New converts brought different backgrounds and expectations. The unity that had marked the early Jerusalem community faced new pressures as Christianity spread across cultural boundaries. Yet Clement carried within himself the memory of that original unity. He had witnessed the love that bound the apostolic community together. He remembered how Peter and Paul, despite their different personalities and approaches, worked together for the gospel. This memory would become crucial as divisions threatened to tear the church apart. The church was entering a new phase. The apostles were gone. The eyewitnesses to Christ's ministry had mostly died. The communities they had founded were becoming independent, confident in their own interpretations and practices. Some began to question whether distant bishops had any authority over their local affairs. Others wondered if the apostolic succession that Clement represented was really necessary. But Clement possessed something that gave his words special power. When he spoke about church unity, he wasn't repeating abstract theology. He was sharing memories of how the apostles themselves had handled similar challenges. When he taught about love and humility, he drew from personal observations of how Peter had treated difficult people and how Paul had corrected wayward communities. This authority would soon be tested in ways Clement could never have imagined. Across the Mediterranean, in a prosperous port city, trouble was brewing. A crisis was developing that would challenge everything the apostles had established about church leadership and authority. The unity that Clement had witnessed in the apostolic community was about to face its first great test. The man who had walked with giants would need to draw upon every memory, every lesson, every moment of grace he had witnessed in their presence. His personal connection to the apostles was about to become the church's lifeline in its darkest hour. The crisis in Corinth demanded immediate attention. Far from Rome, in the bustling port city of Corinth, something terrible was happening. Ships from across the Mediterranean docked at this crossroads of trade, bringing silk from the east and grain from Egypt. Wealthy Romans built grand villas on the hills, while freed slaves opened shops in the crowded markets below. This was a place where fortunes rose and fell with the tides, where ambition mixed with opportunity in ways both beautiful and dangerous. The Christian community in Corinth reflected this restless energy. Paul had planted the church decades earlier, and it had grown into one of the largest Christian gatherings in the Greek world. Merchants who traveled to Rome carried news back and forth. Scholars debated theology in the same forums where philosophers once argued about virtue and truth. The church met in homes scattered throughout the city, from simple apartments near the docks to spacious courtyards in the wealthy districts. But success brought unexpected troubles. The Corinthian Christians had always been prone to divisions. Paul himself had written stern letters about their quarrels and moral failures. Yet the apostles' personal presence had kept the worst conflicts in check. His voice carried authority that settled disputes before they could destroy the community. When he spoke about church leadership, people listened. When he corrected their behavior, they accepted his guidance, even if reluctantly. Now Paul was gone. The eyewitnesses to Christ's ministry had died or moved to distant lands. The Corinthian church was left to govern itself, and the results were heartbreaking. Respected leaders who had served faithfully for years found themselves suddenly cast out of their positions. Men who had baptized new converts and celebrated the Eucharist in their homes were told they were no longer welcome to serve. The community that had once gathered as one family now split into hostile factions. These weren't minor disagreements about worship styles or building plans. The dismissed leaders had been appointed through the apostolic succession that Paul himself had established. Clement refers to bishops and presbyters in ways early scholars debate, but he clearly appeals to an apostolic line of ministry. When the Corinthians rejected these leaders, they were rejecting something far more significant than local preferences. The pain ran deep through the community. Longtime members watched their spiritual fathers being humiliated and forced from their roles. Children who had learned their prayers from these dismissed leaders felt confused and betrayed. Widows who had depended on their pastoral care found themselves abandoned. The unity that had marked the early church gave way to bitter arguments that echoed through the city's Christian households. What made this crisis even more dangerous was its underlying challenge to apostolic authority itself. The rebels weren't simply choosing different leaders. They were claiming the right to decide for themselves who could lead the church. They argued that local communities should govern their own affairs without interference from distant bishops or ancient traditions. This sounded reasonable to many ears, especially in a Greek city that prized democratic ideals and intellectual independence. But this reasoning struck at the heart of how the apostles had organized the church. Peter and Paul hadn't established Christianity as a collection of independent communities free to make their own rules. They had created a unified body with clear lines of authority flowing from Christ through the apostles to their appointed successors. When the Corinthians rejected this structure, they were questioning whether the apostolic pattern still mattered in their new circumstances. The dismissed leaders found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't simply campaign for their jobs like political candidates. Their authority came from their ordination, not from popular support. Yet they also couldn't force their way back into leadership roles that required the community's cooperation. They were caught between their sacred calling and the harsh reality of rejection, unsure whether to fight back or quietly accept their fate. Word of this division spread quickly through the Mediterranean Christian network. Travelers carried letters describing the chaos in Corinth. Other church communities watched nervously, wondering if similar rebellions might break out in their own cities. The unity that Christ had prayed for was fracturing along lines that threatened to spread throughout the Christian world. When news of the Corinthian crisis reached Rome, it deeply troubled Clement. He had witnessed firsthand how the apostles handled church disputes. He remembered Paul's careful balance between firmness and gentleness when correcting wayward communities. He knew that Peter had never hesitated to exercise his authority when unity was at stake. The memories of their leadership style weighed heavily on his mind as he considered how to respond. This wasn't just another pastoral problem that could be solved with patient counseling and prayer. The Corinthian rebellion challenged the fundamental structure that the apostles had established for church governance. If local communities could dismiss their properly appointed leaders whenever they chose, then apostolic succession meant nothing. The careful system of authority that connected every Christian community to the apostolic foundation would collapse into chaos. Clement faced a decision that would echo through church history. As Bishop of Rome and holder of apostolic memories, he possessed unique authority to address this crisis. His letter urged the Corinthian community to repent and to restore the presbyters who had been unjustly removed. But exercising that authority meant claiming a level of influence over distant communities that had never been tested. The apostles were dead. Their immediate successors were scattered. Clement would be speaking not just as one bishop among many, but as the voice of apostolic tradition itself. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the Corinthian rebellion succeeded, other communities might follow their example. The unified church that Christ had established could fragment into countless independent groups, each claiming to follow the gospel while rejecting any authority beyond their own preferences. The apostolic succession that connected the growing church to its founding would become meaningless tradition. This was the first great test of papal authority in church history. Clement's response would either preserve the apostolic structure that Peter and Paul had established, or watch it crumble under the pressure of local independence. Everything the apostles had built hung in the balance, waiting for one man's wisdom to guide the church through its darkest crisis yet. But as Clement prepared his response, he had no idea that his own world was about to face its greatest trial. The emperor was asserting divine honors for himself, and hostility toward Christians was growing. Clement alludes to sudden and repeated calamities that most scholars read as the pressure of Domitian's time. Most scholars date 1 Clement to the 90s AD, around the end of Domitian's reign, which helps explain his reference to repeated calamities. Behind this careful language lay a reality far more terrifying for Rome's Christian community. The streets of Rome became dangerous for believers. Imperial guards could arrest anyone suspected of following Christ. Neighbors turned against neighbors, hoping to gain favor with the authorities by reporting secret Christian gatherings. The simple act of refusing to burn incense before the emperor's statue could mean imprisonment or death. Christian families faced impossible choices. Should they flee the city and abandon their livelihoods? Should they continue meeting for worship and risk discovery? Many who had openly practiced their faith now gathered only in the darkest hours. Before dawn, slipping through narrow alleyways to reach hidden rooms where they could celebrate the Eucharist in hushed voices. Clement watched members of his flock disappear. Some fled to distant provinces where the persecution hadn't yet reached. Others were dragged away by soldiers and never seen again. The lucky ones faced only loss of property or exile. The unlucky ones became entertainment in the Colosseum, torn apart by wild beasts while crowds cheered. Each day brought fresh reports of suffering that tested the community's faith to its breaking point. The Bishop of Rome found himself leading a church under siege. He couldn't move freely through the city to visit the sick or comfort the grieving. Public preaching became impossible. The normal rhythms of church life ground to a halt as Christians learned to practice their faith in shadows and silence. Yet in the midst of this chaos, urgent letters kept arriving from Corinth, pleading for his intervention in their crisis. Picture Clement sitting at his desk by candlelight, surrounded by the evidence of his community's suffering. Letters from frightened families lay beside reports of arrested deacons. Outside his window, the imperial city sparkled with torches that illuminated temples dedicated to false gods. The very air seemed heavy with fear and the smoke from countless pagan sacrifices. In this atmosphere of terror, Clement made a decision that required extraordinary courage. He would write to Corinth not just as a concerned brother bishop, but with the full authority of his apostolic office. He would assert Rome's right to intervene in the affairs of distant churches, even while his own community faced extinction. This wasn't simply pastoral advice offered between equals. This was papal authority being exercised under the most dangerous possible circumstances. The courage this required cannot be overstated. Every letter Clement wrote could be intercepted by imperial spies. Every assertion of Christian authority was an act of defiance against an emperor who claimed divine status. By addressing the Corinthian crisis with such certainty and power, Clement was essentially declaring that Christ's kingdom transcended all earthly persecution, that the Church's unity mattered more than individual safety. Writing under these conditions gave Clement's words a weight they might otherwise have lacked. He wasn't offering theoretical teachings about church unity from the comfort of peaceful retirement. He was speaking from the crucible of suffering, where the cost of faith had been measured in blood and tears. His call for obedience to apostolic authority came from a man who was risking everything to maintain that very authority. The external pressure made internal unity even more crucial. When the empire was trying to destroy Christianity from the outside, divisions within the church became not just pastoral problems, but threats to survival itself. If Christians couldn't maintain peace among themselves, how could they hope to withstand the organized violence of their persecutors? The Corinthian rebellion wasn't just embarrassing. It was potentially fatal to the broader Christian cause. Clement understood that scattered, divided Christian communities would fall one by one to imperial persecution. Only a united church, bound together by shared authority and mutual support, could weather this storm. The rebels in Corinth weren't just rejecting their local bishops. They were weakening the entire network of Christian solidarity that provided strength in times of crisis. Every word Clement wrote carried the urgency of a community fighting for its life. When he spoke about obedience to appointed leaders, he was thinking about Christian families huddled in fear. When he called for unity and peace, he was remembering friends who had died rather than compromise their faith. This wasn't abstract theology. This was survival instruction written by a man who watched his people suffer daily. The strength required to guide others while under attack revealed something profound about apostolic authority. True spiritual leadership wasn't exercised from positions of safety and comfort. It emerged most clearly when leaders chose to serve their flocks despite personal danger. Clement could have remained silent about Corinth, focusing only on his own community's immediate needs. Instead, he chose to fulfill his wider responsibilities, even when doing so increased his risks. His letter would travel across dangerous seas to reach a rebellious community that might reject his authority entirely. Roman ships could be searched. Christian messengers could be arrested. The very act of sending this letter was an act of faith that transcended human calculation. Clement was betting the future of church unity on words written while his world burned around him. The persecution gave Clement's teachings about unity deeper urgency than any peaceful circumstance could provide. When he wrote about the importance of apostolic succession, he was defending a structure that persecution was actively trying to destroy. When he called for submission to properly appointed leaders, he was preserving the only system that could maintain Christian identity under extreme pressure. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city's dangers seemed most distant, Clement prepared to put pen to paper. The words he would write would need to carry the weight of apostolic authority across dangerous waters to a divided community. They would need to speak with the voice of Peter and Paul while addressing challenges the apostles had never faced. Most importantly, they would need to preserve the unity of Christ's church when everything seemed to be falling apart. Clement began to write words that would echo through history. By the light of oil lamps, surrounded by scrolls and parchments, he dipped his reed pen in ink and started what would become known as First Clement. 1 Clement is among the very earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament and was widely read in the early church. While the Gospels and Apostolic letters formed the foundation of faith, Clement's writing became the first bridge connecting apostolic teaching to the growing needs of the universal church. The letter is anonymous in itself, but early tradition consistently ascribes it to Clement and the Roman Church. This single letter carried an enormous burden. It had to heal a devastating split in one of Christianity's most important communities. It needed to restore dismissed leaders without humiliating those who had dismissed them. It required establishing principles of church authority that could prevent similar crises in other cities. Most importantly, it had to accomplish all this while preserving the spirit of Christian love that made unity possible in the first place. Clement drew deeply from his personal memories of Peter and Paul's teachings. He remembered how Peter had handled conflicts in the Jerusalem church, always seeking restoration rather than punishment. He recalled Paul's letters to these same Corinthians, filled with both correction and affection. These weren't distant historical examples for Clement. They were living memories of men he had known personally, conversations he had witnessed, approaches he had seen succeed in bringing peace to troubled communities. The letter reveals Clement's careful balance between fraternal correction and apostolic authority. He addressed the Corinthians as beloved brothers, acknowledging their past faithfulness and expressing genuine grief over their current divisions. Yet beneath this gentle tone ran an unmistakable current of authority. He wasn't simply offering advice that they could accept or reject. He was exercising the authority of his apostolic office, speaking with the voice of Rome's bishop to a community that needed firm guidance back to unity. This letter was more than pastoral advice. It became a model of church governance that established patterns still followed today. Clement showed future bishops how to address serious disorders in distant communities. He demonstrated the proper balance between local autonomy and universal authority. His approach combined theological teaching with practical solutions, creating a template that would guide papal correspondence for centuries to come. The revolutionary ideas Clement put to paper would reshape how Christians understood their relationship to church authority. He wasn't inventing new doctrines or claiming powers the apostles never possessed. Instead, he was applying apostolic principles to new situations that hadn't existed during Peter and Paul's lifetimes. This required both faithfulness to apostolic tradition and wisdom to adapt those traditions to changing circumstances. Clement's letter took weeks to complete. Each section had to be carefully crafted to address different aspects of the crisis. He needed to explain why the dismissed leaders deserved restoration. He had to show the rebels that their actions threatened not just local peace, but the entire structure of Christian community. He required words that would convince both sides to choose unity over their personal grievances. The physical act of writing in ancient Rome was laborious and expensive. Parchment was costly. Good ink required careful preparation. Professional scribes charged high fees for clean copies. Yet Clement spared no expense in creating multiple versions of this letter. He understood that its message needed to reach not just Corinth but Christian communities throughout the empire who were watching to see how this crisis would be resolved. When completed, the letter was entrusted to reliable messengers who would carry it across dangerous seas to its destination. These weren't casual travelers but trusted Christians who understood the importance of their mission. They carried not just Clement's personal thoughts, but the authority of Rome's Apostolic See, delivered to a community that desperately needed guidance back to peace. The letter's impact extended far beyond its immediate purpose. Churches throughout the Mediterranean requested copies once news of its contents spread. Christian communities facing their own conflicts found wisdom in Clement's teachings about unity and submission to proper authority. Bishops dealing with rebellious members discovered practical approaches for restoration that preserved both justice and mercy. Most remarkably, the letter was read aloud during church services alongside Scripture itself. We know it was read aloud in Corinth and other churches well into the 2nd century. Dionysius of Corinth records it as part of their liturgy. This wasn't because Christians considered it equal to apostolic writings, but because they recognized its value as authoritative teaching that applied apostolic principles to contemporary problems. Families gathered around as deacons read Clement's words about love, obedience, and the divine order that governed Christian community. First Clement became the template for papal letters that would follow for centuries. Its structure became the standard format for papal communications. Its tone set the precedent for how future popes would address serious disorders in distant churches. Its theological arguments established the foundation for later developments in church authority and papal primacy. The letter's preservation across nearly 2,000 years testifies to its enduring importance. While many early Christian writings disappeared, First Clement survived in multiple manuscript traditions. Early church fathers quoted from it extensively. Medieval scholars studied it carefully. Modern historians recognize it as one of our most valuable windows into the post-apostolic church. What made this letter truly revolutionary was not its individual teachings, but their combination into a coherent vision of church unity. Clement wove together theology and practical governance, apostolic memory and contemporary needs, firm authority and gentle correction. He created a document that spoke to immediate concerns while establishing principles that would guide the Church for generations. The letter that emerged from Clement's candlelit study in Rome carried within it the seeds of everything the Catholic Church would become. Its teachings about apostolic succession, divine order, and loving authority would echo through councils and papal letters across the centuries. Its vision of unity rooted in obedience to properly appointed leaders would shape how Christians understood their relationship to church hierarchy. But the letter's most profound contribution lay in how Clement explained the source of all church authority. He revealed something beautiful about how divine power flows through human institutions. In his letter, Clement revealed this truth by explaining how God's authority flows through the church. Picture him at his writing desk, remembering conversations with Peter and Paul about how Christ had organized his followers. The apostles hadn't created a loose collection of independent groups. They had established something much more profound, a sacred order that connected every Christian community to God Himself through an unbroken chain of authority. This teaching challenged everything the Corinthian rebels believed about choosing their own leaders. They thought local communities could decide for themselves who would guide them. They believed popular opinion should determine church leadership. They assumed that being Christian meant freedom from outside authority. But Clement's words cut through these assumptions like light piercing darkness. He wrote about Christ being sent from God and the apostles being sent from Christ. This wasn't random human organization. This was divine appointment flowing down through carefully chosen vessels. God the Father had sent His Son with specific authority. Christ had chosen 12 men and given them that same authority. Those apostles had laid hands on others, passing along what they had received. Each step in this chain was deliberate, sacred, and unbreakable. Clement called this the orderly way that God had established for His church. Order wasn't restriction or burden. It was the pattern that allowed divine authority to reach every corner of the Christian world. Without this structure, each community would drift according to human whims and preferences. With it, every church remained connected to the apostolic foundation that Christ Himself had laid. This orderly way became the foundation of apostolic succession. The bishops who led Christian communities didn't hold their authority from popular election or personal charisma. They received it through ordination that traced back to the apostles themselves. When hands were laid on new bishops, they weren't just receiving human approval. They were being connected to a chain of authority that reached back to Christ in the upper room. Clement affirms that the apostles appointed bishops, or overseers, and deacons, and that a lawful succession should continue. Scholars debate how sharply Clement distinguishes these offices, but his letter is one of our earliest witnesses to a norm of apostolic succession. Rather than a fully formed medieval hierarchy, Clement shows the earliest Christian concern for orderly succession. Apostles appointed leaders and provided for successors when they fell asleep. Other approved men should succeed them. Clement understood this wasn't a new invention. He connected these Christian patterns to Old Testament priesthood that had guided God's people for centuries. The Jewish temple had operated according to divine order that distinguished between different levels of service. High priests performed the most sacred duties. Regular priests handled daily temple functions. Levites assisted with various supporting tasks. Each group had specific roles that couldn't be changed by popular vote or personal preference. This temple pattern became Clement's model for understanding Christian ministry. Just as God had organized temple worship with clear levels of authority and responsibility, so Christ had established his church with appointed leaders who served specific functions. Each role carried particular authority, each connected to the others in a pattern that reflected divine wisdom rather than human convenience. The high priest in the temple prefigured the bishop in the church. He alone could enter the Holy of Holies once each year. He alone could offer the most sacred sacrifices for the people's sins. He carried unique responsibility for maintaining proper worship and teaching correct doctrine. When Christians saw their bishops in this light, they understood that episcopal authority wasn't human ambition but sacred calling. Regular priests in the temple pointed toward the ordained ministers who would serve under bishops in Christian communities. They offered daily sacrifices and taught the people. They maintained the temple's sacred functions and guided families in proper worship. Their authority came not from the people they served, but from the high priest who had appointed them. This pattern showed Christians that their local ministers received authority through their bishops, not through popular approval. The Levites who assisted temple worship became a model for Christian deacons. They helped with practical matters that kept worship functioning smoothly. They served the priests and supported the high priest's ministry. They carried real authority within their specific roles while remaining under the guidance of those appointed over them. This showed how even supporting roles in the church participated in the sacred chain of command. Clement grounded church authority in divine order that stretched back through Hebrew history to God's original intentions for his people. This wasn't human invention or later development. This was the same pattern that had always governed how God worked through chosen representatives. Moses hadn't been elected by popular vote. Aaron hadn't campaigned for the high priesthood. David hadn't won his kingdom through democratic process. God chose his servants and gave them authority that came from heaven, not earth. This understanding transformed how Christians viewed their relationship to church leaders. Bishops and ministers weren't employees who could be hired and fired based on performance reviews. They were appointed representatives of divine authority who deserved respect and obedience even when their personalities or decisions seemed difficult. Rejecting properly appointed leaders meant rejecting the divine order that had established them. The rebels in Corinth had forgotten this sacred pattern. They treated their bishops like political officials who served at the pleasure of their constituents. They assumed that being dissatisfied with leadership gave them the right to choose replacements. They thought Christian freedom meant independence from any authority they didn't personally approve. But Clement's teaching showed them they were fighting against God's own design for his church. This passage became one of the clearest early statements of apostolic succession in Christian history. Later church fathers would quote Clement's words when defending episcopal authority against various challenges. Later traditions interpreted Clement in forms that supported more developed hierarchical claims. Medieval theologians would build on his insights when explaining how papal authority connected to apostolic foundation. Modern Catholics still recognize in his teaching the basic structure that governs their church today. The divine chain of command wasn't cold hierarchy or oppressive control. It was God's loving provision for keeping his people united in truth and guided towards salvation. Just as parents provide structure that helps children grow safely, so God provided apostolic authority that would help his church navigate the challenges of a hostile world. Yet Clement understood something crucial that would make all the difference in healing Corinth's wounds. Divine authority needed something more to truly restore broken communities. That power needed to flow through love to truly transform hearts. Picture Clement pausing in his writing, setting down his reed pen as he remembered the apostles' most important lesson. Peter and Paul had never ruled through fear or force. They had led through love that transformed hearts and made obedience feel like joy rather than burden. The same love that had drawn people to Christ needed to flow through every aspect of church life. In his letter to the Corinthians, Clement opened his heart about love as the foundation of all Christian unity. This wasn't romantic feeling or casual affection. This was the deep, sacrificial love that Christ had shown on the cross. The love that seeks the good of others even when they cause pain. The love that forgives repeatedly and never gives up hope for restoration. Without this love, all the proper structures and correct authorities would remain cold and lifeless. The Corinthians had forgotten this essential truth in their bitter disputes. They had focused so intently on who was right and who was wrong that they lost sight of what made them family. Brothers who had once shared bread at the same table now refused to speak to each other. Leaders who had baptized each other's children now treated former friends as enemies. The love that should have covered their disagreements had been replaced by pride that magnified every offense. Clement wrote words that still echo through Christian hearts today. He reminded them that love covers a multitude of sins. Not because love ignores wrongdoing or pretends problems don't exist, but because love chooses to see beyond present failures to the restoration that remains possible. Love remembers the good that people have done even when they are currently doing wrong. Love believes in redemption even when circumstances seem hopeless. This covering wasn't a blanket thrown over problems to hide them from view. It was more like the gentle hands of a parent tending a child's wounds. Love acknowledged the hurt while working patiently for healing. Love faced the reality of division while refusing to accept it as permanent. Love grieved over broken relationships while continuing to hope for reconciliation that seemed impossible to human eyes. Clement insists that charity unites us to God, a line he returns to as the heart of reconciliation. This union wasn't future promise, but present reality available to every believer. When Christians chose to love despite being hurt, they participated in God's own nature. When they forgave those who had wronged them, they reflected Christ's forgiveness of their own sins. Love became the bridge that connected human hearts to divine grace in ways that transformed entire communities. The perfection that love brings wasn't sinless behavior that never made mistakes. It was the completeness that comes when all parts of the body work together for the same purpose. A church filled with love might still have members who struggled with personal failings. But those individual weaknesses wouldn't destroy the unity that held them together. Love created space for growth while maintaining the bonds that made growth possible. Clement connected this spiritual truth to practical charity that the Corinthians could see and touch. Love wasn't just inner feeling or theological concept. It showed itself through actions that met real needs. He even points to hospitality and care for widows as ways love heals community. When church members shared resources with struggling families, they were demonstrating the charity that covers sins. These visible acts of kindness created the atmosphere where forgiveness could flourish. The apostolic successor called his readers to humility and following what he termed the glorious rule of their tradition. This tradition wasn't empty ritual or human custom. It was the pattern of love that the apostles had learned from Christ himself. The tradition included specific practices like caring for the poor and honoring proper authorities. But underneath all these particular expressions lay the fundamental commitment to love that made everything else meaningful. Humility became the soil where love could grow strong roots. Pride had caused the Corinthian crisis by convincing people that their personal preferences mattered more than community unity. Humility reversed this destructive pattern by teaching people to consider others more important than themselves. When church members approached conflicts with humble hearts, Love found ways to bring healing that pride could never discover. Clement showed how love transforms obedience from burden to joy. When authority operates without love, it feels oppressive and creates resentment. People follow orders reluctantly, while planning their escape. But when love flows between leaders and followers, obedience becomes willing cooperation toward shared goals. Church members submit to their bishops not from fear, but from trust that their leaders truly want what's best for everyone. This transformation touched every relationship within the Christian community. Wives who followed their husband's leadership out of love found freedom rather than restriction. Children who honored their parents from grateful hearts discovered wisdom rather than arbitrary rules. Church members who accepted their bishop's guidance with trusting spirits experienced peace rather than conflict. Love-filled authority created safety where people could admit their mistakes without fear of harsh punishment. It provided guidance that helped people grow rather than criticism that crushed their spirits. It offered correction wrapped in hope for restoration rather than condemnation that destroyed all possibility of change. Under this kind of leadership, Christian communities flourished like gardens tended by skillful farmers. Clement's vision of love-filled authority became the Catholic ideal that would guide church leadership for centuries. Future bishops would study his letter to learn how to combine firm guidance with gentle care. Popes would follow his example of addressing serious problems while maintaining hope for reconciliation. The balance between authority and love that Clement modeled became the standard by which all church leadership would be measured. This wasn't theoretical teaching that sounded beautiful, but couldn't work in real situations. Clement was writing to people whose relationships had been shattered by conflict. He was addressing a community where love had been replaced by suspicion and hostility. His words carried power because they offered practical hope for healing that the Corinthians desperately needed. Yet even love-filled teaching sometimes requires the weight of apostolic authority to accomplish its purpose. Clement had offered gentle instruction and patient explanation. But the crisis in Corinth demanded something more direct. Clement's tone became unmistakably authoritative as he prepared to address the crisis with the directness it required. His letter had offered gentle teaching about love and divine order. He had reminded the Corinthians of their glorious past and expressed hope for their restoration. But teaching alone would not heal this crisis. The time had come for firm correction that left no room for misunderstanding about what needed to happen next. Picture Clement setting down his pen and breathing slowly before writing the most difficult part of his letter. He had moved from brother to teacher. Now he must speak as an apostolic successor whose words carried the authority of Rome's episcopal chair. This wasn't personal opinion or pastoral advice. This was correction delivered with the full power of his sacred office. The shift in tone was unmistakable to anyone who heard the letter read aloud in Corinth. Clement's voice became firm and clear as he addressed the rebels directly. He spoke of those who would resist the restoration he was commanding. He warned about the consequences of continued disobedience. His words carried the weight of someone who knew he was speaking not just his own thoughts, but the will of Christ himself. Clement wrote stern warnings about disobedience to apostolic teaching that revealed how seriously he viewed their crisis. This wasn't a local dispute that could be solved through compromise or negotiation. This was rebellion against the divine order that governed the entire church. When the Corinthians rejected their properly appointed leaders, they were rejecting the apostolic authority that had established those leaders in the first place. His most powerful words addressed those who might resist his instructions. He warns that to reject what is spoken by him through us risks grave error. This wasn't empty threat or human anger. This was the reality that resistance to proper church authority meant resistance to Christ himself. The chain of command that connected Rome to the apostles, and the apostles to Christ, made Clement's words carry divine weight. Clement's tone is unmistakably authoritative, and many later theologians and Catholic tradition view this as an early exercise of Roman primacy. Scholars, however, differ. Some see it as fraternal correction rather than a claim to universal jurisdiction. Previous bishops of Rome had certainly held positions of honor and respect among Christian communities. But Clement was doing something unprecedented by directly intervening in the affairs of a distant church and demanding specific actions. He was claiming the right to restore dismissed leaders in a community hundreds of miles away from Rome. The authority Clement exercised wasn't political power or administrative control. It was spiritual authority that flowed from his position as successor to Peter in the Roman Church. He claimed the right to speak into the Corinthian situation because his office connected him to the apostolic foundation in ways that gave his words special power. This wasn't human ambition, but sacred responsibility that he could not ignore. Yet even in his sternest moments, Clement maintained the balance between pastoral care and necessary correction. He grieved over the division that had torn apart the Corinthian community. He expressed genuine love for the people he was correcting. He offered hope for restoration alongside warnings about continued rebellion. His firmness came from love that wanted healing, not from anger that desired punishment. Clement made clear that he was speaking not just as a concerned brother, but as an apostolic successor whose words deserved respectful attention. He reminded the Corinthians that Rome's church had been established by Peter and Paul themselves. He pointed to his own connection to those blessed apostles who had seen Christ in the flesh. His authority wasn't self-appointed leadership, but inherited responsibility passed down through sacred ordination. This established the pattern that would guide future papal interventions in local church disputes for centuries to come. Clement showed how the Bishop of Rome could address serious problems in distant communities while respecting their local customs and traditions. He demonstrated the proper balance between universal authority and particular circumstances that would become the hallmark of effective papal leadership. The letter revealed how pastoral correction could be both firm and gentle, both authoritative and loving. Future popes would study Clement's approach when facing similar crises in their own times. They would learn from his example how to exercise necessary authority while maintaining the spirit of Christian charity that made correction acceptable to those who received it. Clement's claim to speak with apostolic authority wasn't based on personal charisma or political power. It rested on his position as successor to Peter in the church, where both Peter and Paul had shed their blood for Christ. This connection to the apostolic martyrs gave his words special weight that the Corinthians could not easily dismiss. He was speaking from the chair that the apostles themselves had established. The correction he offered wasn't punishment designed to humiliate the rebels or make them suffer for their mistakes. It was restoration that would heal the wounds their rebellion had created in the community. Clement wanted the dismissed leaders returned to their positions not to prove his own power, but to restore the divine order that would bring peace to the troubled church. His words about resistance to apostolic teaching carried prophetic weight that went far beyond the immediate Corinthian situation. He was establishing principles that would guide the church through countless future disputes. His warning that opposition to proper authority meant opposition to Christ himself would echo through councils and papal letters across the centuries. This firm but compassionate tone would soon cross the Mediterranean to reach ears that had grown deaf to local calls for peace. The question now was whether the Corinthians would accept this voice of apostolic authority or continue their rebellion against the divine order that Clement represented. The letter was complete, sealed, and ready for its dangerous journey across the sea. Trusted messengers arrived at the bustling port where Paul had first preached decades earlier. They sought out the Christian community, now fractured and wounded by months of bitter conflict. The letter they carried bore the seal of Rome's bishop, written with the authority of apostolic succession itself. Picture the moment when church leaders gathered to hear Clement's words read aloud for the first time. The dismissed bishops sat alongside those who had dismissed them. Families who had stopped speaking to each other found themselves in the same room. Children who had learned to whisper about church troubles looked up at their parents' worried faces. The air felt heavy with months of unspoken pain and stubborn pride. The reader's voice carried through the hushed assembly as Clement's teachings about divine order and apostolic authority filled the space. His words about love covering sins touched hearts that had grown hard with resentment. His explanations of the sacred chain connecting God to Christ to apostles to bishops challenged assumptions that had seemed so reasonable just moments before. His gentle corrections mixed with firm commands created a tension that no one could ignore. Then came the moment when the community had to choose between division and unity. Clement's letter didn't offer compromise solutions that would let everyone save face. It demanded clear restoration of the dismissed leaders and submission to the apostolic order that those leaders represented. The rebels faced a decision that would define not just their own futures, but the future of their entire church. They could accept Rome's authority and heal their community, or reject it and face the consequences of continued rebellion. The choice wasn't easy for people who had convinced themselves they were fighting for important principles. They had argued that local communities should govern themselves without interference from distant bishops. They had claimed that popular opinion should determine church leadership. They had insisted that being Christian meant freedom from authorities they didn't personally approve. Now Clement's letter challenged every one of these beliefs. Yet something powerful stirred in the hearts of those who heard his words. The authority he claimed wasn't harsh domination, but loving guidance toward restoration. His correction came wrapped in genuine care for their spiritual well-being. His commands pointed toward healing that their own efforts had failed to achieve. The voice of apostolic succession spoke with a gentleness that made submission feel like coming home rather than giving up. Dionysius of Corinth reports that Clement's letter was read publicly and used as admonition. The record suggests the community accepted the appeal and restored order. This wasn't grudging compliance, but genuine recognition that Rome's bishop had spoken truth that could heal their wounds. The men who had been cast out returned to their pastoral duties with hearts full of forgiveness rather than bitterness. The rebels who had dismissed them asked for pardon, and received it with the same love that Clement had shown in his letter. Neighbors knelt at the same altar once again. The unity that had seemed impossible just days before became reality through the power of apostolic authority exercised with genuine love. News of this remarkable restoration spread quickly throughout the Christian world. Other churches began requesting copies of Clement's letter, eager to learn from his wisdom about handling their own disputes. Bishops facing rebellions in their own communities found practical guidance in his approach. Christian families struggling with divisions discovered hope in his teachings about love and forgiveness. First Clement was read alongside Scripture in many communities throughout the Mediterranean world, not because Christians considered it equal to apostolic writings, but because they recognized its value as authoritative teaching that applied biblical principles to contemporary problems. Deacons included passages from Clement's letter in their regular readings during worship services. Parents quoted his words about unity when teaching their children about proper relationships within the church. The letter spread throughout the early Christian world with remarkable speed. Ships carrying grain and olive oil also carried copies of Clement's teachings to ports across the empire. Travelers packed carefully copied sections alongside their personal belongings. Scholars made additional copies for their own libraries and shared them with colleagues in distant cities. The wisdom that had healed Corinth began healing other communities facing similar struggles. Churches in Syria quoted Clement's teachings about apostolic succession when defending their bishops against local challenges. Communities in Egypt found comfort in his words about love covering sins when working through their own painful divisions. Christian families in Gaul discovered practical guidance in his instructions about submission to proper authority. The letter that had addressed one specific crisis became a source of wisdom for countless others. Many credit the letter with healing that crisis and helping to prevent a wider rupture at that time. If the Corinthian rebellion had succeeded, other communities might have followed their example. The unified church that Christ had established could have fragmented into countless independent groups, each claiming to follow the gospel while rejecting any authority beyond their own preferences. The apostolic succession that connected growing churches to their founding would have become meaningless tradition. Instead, Clement's intervention preserved the principle that would hold Christianity together through centuries of challenges. His exercise of Roman authority established the pattern that future popes would follow when addressing serious crises in distant churches. His balance of firmness and gentleness became the model for pastoral correction that preserved both truth and charity. His success in restoring unity proved that apostolic authority could heal even the deepest divisions when exercised with genuine love. The church that emerged from this crisis was stronger than before. The Corinthians had learned to value unity over personal preferences. Other communities had witnessed the power of apostolic intervention to heal what seemed beyond repair. The entire Christian world had seen how proper authority could preserve the gospel message while adapting to new circumstances. Clement's letter had done more than solve a local problem. It had shown how the church's growing structure could maintain apostolic truth across vast distances and cultural differences. But woven throughout his practical teachings about authority and obedience lay something even more profound. His words carried insights about the very heart of Christian faith that would shape the Church's understanding for centuries to come. Clement's teachings about salvation formed the bedrock beneath everything else he wrote. Hidden within his letter was profound wisdom about how we are saved, woven between his words about church authority and Christian unity. As he addressed the Corinthian crisis, Clement revealed truths about salvation that came from his personal memories of apostolic teaching and his deep understanding of how God's grace works in human hearts. Clement affirms justification by faith. He writes, "We are not justified by ourselves, but by that faith through which Almighty God has justified all men," though Clement also insists faith must bear fruit in love. Yet elsewhere he stresses that genuine faith shows itself in love and works. Historians note lively debate about how to interpret his exact soteriology. This wasn't casual observation, but careful theology drawn from his conversations with Peter and Paul. He had heard these apostles explain how salvation comes as God's gift rather than human achievement. He remembered their teachings about the grace that transforms hearts before any good works can flow from them. This teaching sparked discussions among early Christians about the relationship between faith and works in salvation. Some communities emphasized faith so strongly that they neglected the good works that should flow from genuine belief. Others focused so intensely on righteous behavior that they forgot salvation comes through God's grace rather than human effort. Clement's letter addressed this tension with wisdom that preserved both essential truths. He taught that we are justified by faith from the very beginning of our Christian journey. Salvation doesn't come through accumulating enough good deeds to earn God's approval. It arrives the moment we trust in Christ with hearts that God has already prepared through His grace. This faith justifies us completely, making us righteous in God's sight before we have time to prove ourselves through our actions. The foundation of our relationship with God rests on His mercy, not our merit. Yet Clement insisted that this justifying faith must be living and active through love. Faith wasn't mere intellectual agreement with correct doctrines about God. It was trust that transforms the entire person, producing love that shows itself through actions. Dead faith that produces no good works wasn't really faith at all. True faith creates new hearts that naturally flow with love toward God and neighbor. This love becomes the evidence that faith is genuine, rather than the cause that earns salvation. Clement described a careful balance between divine grace and human response that preserved both God's sovereignty and human responsibility. God initiates salvation by preparing hearts to receive faith. He provides the grace that makes belief possible. He transforms sinners into saints through his own power. Yet humans must respond to this grace with faith that accepts God's gift. They must allow their justified hearts to produce the love that faith naturally creates. This cooperation with grace doesn't earn salvation, but shows that salvation has already been received. This balance connected directly to his earlier teaching about love perfecting the elect. The perfection that love brings wasn't sinless behavior that never fails. It was the completeness that comes when justified hearts produce the love that God intended from the beginning. Christians who have been justified by faith then grow in love throughout their lives. This love doesn't add to their justification, but demonstrates that their justification is real and active. Clement's early, formative, and influential approach would shape later Catholic teaching about justification in ways that would become crucial during theological debates centuries later. His emphasis on faith as the foundation of salvation preserved the truth that we cannot earn our way to heaven through good works. His insistence that faith must produce love maintained the reality that genuine faith changes how people live. His balance between grace and response became a model for understanding how salvation works in practical Christian life. He showed that faith and love work together rather than in opposition to each other. This wasn't faith plus works equals salvation. This was faith that naturally produces works because God's grace transforms the entire person. Love flows from justified hearts like water from a spring. It comes naturally because the source has been changed. Christians don't perform good works to become righteous. They perform good works because they have already been made righteous through faith. This understanding supported Clement's vision of church unity in profound ways. Christians who remembered they were saved by grace alone had reason for humility that made unity possible. They couldn't claim superiority over other believers, since they all depended equally on God's mercy. They couldn't earn their place in the church through personal achievements, since membership came through faith that God Himself had given. This common dependence on grace created bonds that transcended human differences. The faith that justified also created love that sought unity rather than division. Hearts transformed by God's grace naturally wanted to preserve the peace that Christ had established in His church. Justified Christians found joy in submitting to apostolic authority because their faith taught them to trust God's wisdom more than their own preferences. Love flowing from justified hearts sought the good of the whole community rather than personal advantage. Clement's theological foundation made his practical instructions about church order more than human wisdom. When he called for restoration of dismissed leaders, he was appealing to Christians who understood they were saved by grace and called to live in love. When he insisted on proper submission to apostolic authority, he was addressing people who knew their justification came through faith that naturally produced humble obedience. His vision of unity rested on theological truths about how salvation works in human hearts. This foundation stone of faith supporting love created the bedrock on which all church authority could safely rest. Leaders who remembered they were justified by faith alone would exercise their authority with humility. Followers who understood their salvation came through grace would submit to proper leadership with grateful hearts. The entire structure of apostolic succession found its strength in the theological reality that all Christians, whether leaders or followers, depended equally on God's mercy for their salvation. The wisdom Clement shared in his pastoral letter revealed how sound theology supported practical church unity in ways that mere organizational structure never could. Yet even as his teachings spread across the Christian world, The man himself was preparing to face his final test. Clement's death remains wrapped in mystery that reveals as much about early Christian memory as it does about historical facts. The man who had walked with Peter and Paul, who had written the letter that saved church unity, faced his own final test of faith. Yet different sources tell different stories about his last years, creating a puzzle that has puzzled historians for centuries. Some accounts describe Clement being sent into exile under Emperor Trajan's persecution. Picture an elderly bishop, bent with age but strong in spirit, forced to leave the Christian community he had shepherded for decades. The Romans often banished troublesome leaders rather than making them martyrs who might inspire others. Clement may have spent his final years in some distant province, continuing to write letters and encourage believers far from the city where he had exercised papal authority. Later legends say he was exiled and executed by being tied to an anchor, and this powerful image entered Christian art. But the earliest sources do not record the martyrdom, so the story is considered a later tradition. According to these accounts, Roman soldiers tied an anchor around Clement's neck and threw him into the sea. The anchor that dragged him to the ocean floor became forever linked with his memory. Christians began using anchors to represent hope that reaches beyond death and faith that holds firm even when storms rage. This anchor symbol spread throughout Christian art and devotion. Early believers carved anchors on tomb walls in the Roman catacombs. Medieval churches displayed anchor-shaped crosses above their altars. Sailors and fishermen claimed Clement as their patron, trusting his prayers to guide them safely through dangerous waters. The anchor became a sign of hope that death could never destroy. In the 9th century, Cyril claimed to have found bones and an anchor in the Crimea and translated relics to Rome, where they were placed in the Basilica of Saint Clement. The saint, who had once written from Rome to distant Corinth, had returned home after centuries of exile. The Basilica of Saint Clement was built to house his relics and preserve his memory for future generations. But this church became much more than a simple tomb. It grew into a layered monument to Christian history itself. The current basilica sits atop an earlier church, which was built over a Roman house where Christians may have gathered in apostolic times. Archaeological excavations have revealed these layers of sacred history, creating a physical representation of how faith builds upon faith across the centuries. Visitors to San Clemente can descend through these layers of time. The upper basilica displays medieval frescoes that tell stories of Clement's life and miracles. The lower level reveals the earlier church with its ancient mosaics and marble columns. Deeper still lie the Roman foundations, including a temple to Mithras that was already ancient when Clement first arrived in Rome. Each generation found new meaning in Clement's witness. Medieval monks saw in him a model of scholarly devotion who preserved apostolic traditions through careful writing. Renaissance humanists admired his role in maintaining classical learning during dark times. Counter-Reformation Catholics pointed to his letter as proof of papal authority that reached back to apostolic times. Modern ecumenists find in his approach a balance of firmness and charity that could heal contemporary divisions. His memory lives on in ways that go beyond historical study or archaeological discovery. Catholic churches around the world bear his name. Parents baptize their children with Clement as their patron saint. Students of church history discover in his letter insights that feel surprisingly relevant to modern challenges. Priests struggling with difficult parish conflicts find wisdom in his balance of authority and love. The Basilica of San Clemente continues to draw pilgrims who come seeking more than historical curiosity. They descend through the layers of sacred time, touching stones that connect them to the earliest Christian communities. They pray before his relics, asking for the same courage that enabled him to write with apostolic authority while persecution raged around him. They light candles that flicker like the oil lamps by which he wrote his famous letter. Sacred spaces like this preserve more than historical artifacts. They maintain living connections between past and present that allow ancient wisdom to speak to contemporary hearts. When modern Catholics struggle with questions of authority and obedience, they can visit the tomb of a man who faced similar challenges with grace. When church leaders wonder how to correct errors while maintaining charity, they can study the example of someone who succeeded in this delicate balance. Yet Clement's true immortality lies neither in legends about miraculous martyrdom nor in elaborate basilicas built to house his remains. His lasting influence flows through the Church's continued unity that his letter helped preserve. Every time Catholics around the world gather for Mass under the authority of their bishops, they participate in the apostolic succession that Clement defended. Every time church leaders exercise their authority with the gentleness he modeled, they extend his witness into new circumstances. The saint who bridged the apostolic age with the growing church continues to offer peace to restless hearts through the unity he helped preserve. His letter still speaks to communities torn by division. His example still guides leaders who must balance truth with charity. His memory still offers hope to anyone who wonders whether ancient faith can address modern challenges. Clement's gentle voice carries across the centuries, whispering the same peace he brought to Corinth's troubled waters. His witness continues to shape how we understand the balance between authority and love in our daily lives. Tonight, as you rest, remember that Clement's gentle voice still whispers peace to troubled hearts. His letter crossed dangerous seas to heal a broken church. His words about love covering sins still comfort families torn by disagreement. His teaching about humble obedience still guides communities toward unity. Let his example of loving authority guide you in your own relationships. When you face conflicts at home or work, remember how Clement balanced firmness with charity. Tonight, choose one small act of charity or a prayer for someone who has hurt you. Sleep peacefully, knowing you belong to the same church that Clement helped preserve through his faithful witness. May God grant you the humility to forgive and the peace of Christ to rest within you. If you enjoy these stories, please remember to like this podcast and subscribe to be notified of future episodes. Also, please comment below and let us know what other saints you'd like us to cover in future episodes. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful night's sleep.